Hello, my name is Justin Bair, and this is Methodantics, episode 16. Um, for Methodantics, we investigate dusty ideas. That's the whole point, is to learn more about what we do in worship, specifically in St. Luke's, but also in settings that you may be familiar with or you may find yourself in now, and questions that you may have had about how it looks or why we do what we do or who's up there. And many of these questions I've had myself, and so I sit crisscross applesauce masked in front of the sage in the rainbow chair, and he answers all of my questions. I will let him introduce himself.
I don't understand any of that, but I'm Sid Davis, and I'm the Director of Music and Fine Arts at St. Luke's, United Methodist Church, and glad to be here with my friends Justin Bair. And today, our special guest is Reverend Michelle Manuel, and she's going to tell us about all things United Methodist clergy. I know, she says she's new to this game, and she may not know all those things, but we're going to talk about all those things. And why don't we start off, Michelle, with tell us what you're comfortable telling us about your call, how you came to be clergy.
Yeah, I am new to the clergy game, but it took me about 10 years to complete the ordination process, which I think is probably a little long, but it's a long process. But I received my calling to ministry in college, and it was a supernatural type of experience on a retreat in the mountains of New Mexico. And so the land of enchantment, right, happened to me. And I have been pointed toward ministry ever since. That was in 2007. And I went to seminary in 2010. I began my candidacy process in 2010. And I was at seminary for about 6 years and all that. Graduated and got into ministry and then came here. But my calling, if I had to articulate it, would certainly be to the local church. That's the kind of United Methodist elder party line, is that we are within the local church, which means in a congregation, pastoring and shepherding. But that manifests differently for each individual and how each individual is gifted. And so, I have a propensity to be more of a prophet than a pastor at times. And so kind of pushing, I think prophets in scripture, first of all, are not dealt with well, right? Prophets get stoned and, all that. But the prophet, I believe, says to the church, we could do better. We could do better. There's some really good stuff here, but how can we be a little bit better? So sometimes that comes off in not such a good way, but it is what it is. We live in a world where we're just trying to follow Jesus. So I'm more of a prophet than a pastor, but I do lean into that pastoral side often, and I care about people. I really like to hear about people and get to know their lives and what they need and what ails them and all that kind of stuff.
Very cool. And you haven't been at St. Luke's for much longer than I have. I was hired July 2019, and you were here just a little bit before that.
Yeah, I mean, I started July 1st, 2019.
Oh, wow. I thought, for some reason, I thought you were at least spring or something earlier, but so just a couple weeks.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Well, you're still wiser than me in many ways. And a lot of the reason I brought you on is completely selfish. And it's because there's, I was hired as a worship coordinator, which is 90% of what I do. And there's so much that I don't know about, like, what am I allowed to make people do in a service, and who is supposed to do this thing? And no, you're not supposed to say that. They're supposed to say that. And so this is going to help me, I think, do my job better. And so I'm glad to have you on, because you are an expert. Even if you're new to being clergy, you're an expert to me.
Yes.
So, well, good. You know more than at least one person in this room.
Yes. Good. Yeah. I mean, I'm in my 5th year of pastoral ministry. So, and in my second appointment, St. Luke's is my second appointment here. But yes, I know some stuff. I know some stuff about the gospel, about the church. Yeah.
So let's do kind of first a broad flyover. So my background was non-denominational, and sort of throughout that process, I learned that essentially that meant that everybody was self-governed, that you could plant a church and you were associated with, a lot of people didn't know this, but the Stone Campbell movement, the Restoration movement, and that's like Christian Church, Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ. And so we didn't have anybody else that we had to answer to or ask questions or ask permission. Our eldership they were elected by the church, and they were a board of people that they were sort of the spiritual leaders of the church.
Okay.
You have a board of deacons, which they were a little bit more of the practical side, helping with like events and what is the church actually going to be doing. But I mean, if you were the senior pastor of your church, you were it. You were the top of the totem pole.
Right.
And then so coming into Methodism and learning that like, no, there's these conferences and sometimes people will tell you where to go and you can ask, but then there's like this top dog, and I don't even know if there's a top dog on top of that top dog. So give me like you can do bottom up or top down. Give me an overview of how this works.
Well, it does make me nervous when there are like just senior pastors who are not governed, right? And that's not how the Methodist Church is. It's like, well, like where's his check and balance, and so I think can get really hairy and into like some really bad spots, right? Unchecked power. So the Methodist Church has a lot of checks and balances, for better or worse. Sometimes that keeps us a slow moving ship because we got committees, man. And I'm not even just talking about like each church. Of course, each church has governing committees, but the organization, the institution as a whole, has lots and lots of governing bodies, I guess. So at the very top is the bishops. I want to say, of course, everybody in the comments is going to like correct me if I throw out exact numbers. So feel free to put in the comments how wrong I am. But I think there's like 67 bishops, 66.
That's worldwide.
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Yeah. And bishops preside over what are called annual conferences. So for example, we have a bishop. Our bishop is named Scott Jones, and he presides over the Texas Annual Conference, which is one of 4 conferences in Texas. So Texas has quite a few conferences and bishops. Other states, like the Louisiana Conference, is just Louisiana, and they have Bishop Cynthia Harvey there. So so the bishop appoints elders to local churches.
And elders are pastors. They are.
Yes. There's 2 ordination tracks, orders of ordination, the elders and then the deacons. And elders itinerate, which means that we are appointed by the bishop and we are asked to move. And all of that is a sort of I want to say sort of a collaborative process, because the bishop works alongside his or her cabinet to kind of take an inventory of the openings and an inventory of who each pastor is, because they're looking for kind of the culture and the personality of the church to really be a best fit for the senior pastor, the elder that they'll place there. Because it used to be kind of a rule of thumb. I think pastors moved every 3 years. But now everybody moves every 3 years, and now the pastors kind of need to be the fixture in the community, I think. But yeah, so the cabinet, the bishop's cabinet. So there's bishop, then there's district superintendent, and the district superintendents make up the cabinet. And there are districts within the annual conference, thinking geographically again. and I forget how many districts we have in ours, maybe 8. We're in the South Central District, and we have a district superintendent named Elijah Stanzel, and Dr. Stanzel is, for all intents and purposes, our district superintendents are pastors to the pastors, but mostly if we need support, if we have issues within our congregation, if we are interested in starting new initiatives or maybe planting a church or whatever, we talk to Dr. Stansel, we talk to our district superintendent.
Do they serve local congregations like the superintendents?
They do not.
Okay.
They serve a 7-year term. And then, so they come out of serving churches, and then they serve a 7-year term. And then they go back into serving churches. So they are elders, as well. So talking about elders and deacons, those are the main 2 ordination tracks that we have in the Methodist Church. Have you heard about these elders and these deacons?
A little bit, but again,
Yeah.
like we had the same terminology. They were very different roles. Like no elders or deacons in the non-denominational church had to be ordained or had to have really any proper education or anything like that.
Right.
But they were in these kind of leadership roles. So
Right.
that was a bit of a jump for me.
Yes. And I will just say, as a woman in ministry, all of that sounds like a little bit of a nightmare, because usually the people who the community thinks God has called to these roles are males. And so that's kind of difficult for female pastors. And of course there are churches who, the role at the head of the church is supposed to be male according to their interpretation of scripture. We obviously don't believe that in the Methodist Church. But yes, so deacons are an order of clergy. They are called to, in the Methodist Church, they are called to the ministry of word, service, compassion, and justice. Whereas the elder is called to word, sacrament, order, and service.
Interesting.
So there's a little bit of overlap, but there are very distinct kind of roles and distinct scopes of practice for each elder or deacon. And so deacons,
is that kind of to help you align, like if you're hired in as an elder or a deacon for a church, like you're not going to be surprised by what they're asking you to do as a leader of that church. Like it's fairly well prescribed, like you're not going to be doing this stuff, you're going to be doing this stuff, kind of thing.
It is, except, probably in the local church, the elder and the deacon, it all kind of plays out very similar, except the deacons find their own jobs. So they are hired on the staff of a church with the understanding that they will be over this type of ministry and over this type of ministry. And whereas an elder, senior pastors are, I would say, always elders. I'm sure people can talk in the comments about not, but senior pastors are always elders, or local pastors, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But that's kind of a third set of ordination, a local pastor, a licensed local pastor.
This is probably a terrible analogy, but it's the way I'm trying to make it make sense in my head. Could you say like elders are sort of like physicians or doctors, and deacons are kind of like nurses? Like
I'm not going to say, I will not. My deacon friends, no, I will not say that. No.
All right.
Although nurses are very important. Okay. But yeah, no, it's just different orders. It's just different responsibilities. And so a deacon, the easiest way to say it is that the deacon is the bridge from the local church to the world. So I would have been a great deacon as a prophet who's calling people to let's reflect on our individual racism and on our systemic racism. That's kind of the traditional way a deacon would function. Ministries that serve the disenfranchised, the poor, all of that. That's usually diaconal, is how we would say it. They are involved.
Diaconal is the adjectival version of deacon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. They are involved in worship services, for sure.
Don't preside at communion.
But they do not preside over the sacraments. Right. So that's where those 4 words start to differ. The elder presides over communion and baptism, though the deacon is expected to participate in, as a supporting role. And deacons can give communion like off-site, but technically it has to be under the authority of the elder from that local church congregation. So that's a pretty distinct difference that, quite frankly, caused me to, because I would have been a great deacon, honestly. Social justice, outreach ministry, all of that is a passion of mine. But I very much feel called to sacrament and like the kind of the priestly nature of presiding over that. So yeah, those are distinctive. It's also distinctive that the deacon is not itinerant. And so because of the logistics of kind of life, you'll see a lot more females are deacons or choose the deacon route. Because I have found, of course, this is going to be controversial, but I have found that mothers will make decisions based on what's best for the family. And to be honest, the whole family signs up for itinerancy. Mm-hmm. So my whole family is signed up for it. My husband's career, if we get called somewhere else, we have to work that out. If your kid is in the middle of a school year, you have to work that out. So, yeah. And so deacons find their own positions, and elders are appointed by the bishop.
Let me ask a question that's completely off the structural thing.
Mm-hmm.
I know that your background, at least in the church before this church, mm-hmm. you had a lot of experience in contemporary worship.
Yes.
And now you find yourself in traditional worship more often than contemporary worship.
Right.
But I also know that does appeal to you. Tell me why and what of that speaks to you.
That traditional appeals to me.
Mm-hmm. What do you find in traditional worship that resonates with you?
There is a sense of coming home to it because I wasn't really raised in a church during my teen years. I did attend a Methodist church until 6th grade and was heavily involved in choir and children's ministry, and all of that was in traditional church. So there is a sense of coming home to hymns and the organ and I don't know if you want to say like the pomp and circumstance of like the procession. We follow the cross, we keep our shoulders to the cross, following the cross, like all of that. As I have gotten older has had more meaning. As a kid, I was like, these responsive readings, people sound like robots, and I didn't get it. And now I'm like, people have been saying that, like praying the Psalms for generations. And yet I can pray this and I still feel it. I still very much identify and connect with that. So there's a sense of being a part of something bigger than myself, and being a part of something bigger than just my worship experience on a Sunday morning in a dark room with smoke machines and lights and my arms raised and only I'm the only one in the room. It's just me and Jesus. Like that's a thing. And that is very meaningful to certain people in certain stages of their life. But for me, I've kind of shifted back. Yeah.
So ritual speaks to you.
Ritual speaks to me. Yeah. And again, with the sacrament piece of the order of the elder, there's very much ritual and rites and all of that. Mm-hmm.
If I can elaborate on that or expound on that, I think I grew up in kind of the suburban lifestyle where everything was new. All the houses were new, the strip centers were new, the schools were new, and it always felt really nice to have like the fresh, clean, new thing.
Yeah.
And it was always it was nice, I guess I could put it, but it was really comfortable. And then I guess really since moving to Houston in 2012 and coming to St. Luke's at that time, and then also studying in seminary and just sort of being a general history nerd, and I've begun to connect more and more with history and with older things instead of like the newest, freshest thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's led us to even things like we just moved into a house that was built in 1958, which has lots and lots of 60-year-old house problems that we're learning. But I think the reason I thought of all this is because of what you said about like connecting to history and connecting to the past, and discovering that it's not old and dusty, but there's a richness to joining in with things that people have been doing. I mean, think about like Passover's happening right now, and they've been doing that for like 4,000 years.
Yeah.
Let me talk about connection to the past. You know, St. Luke's is 75 years old, and that to me feels ancient compared to what I've been experienced, you know? And so that drew me just in a completely different direction from where I came. So I like that too.
Yeah. And certainly there's a place for both. I can very much appreciate the struggle that the church has gone through, like the big church, you know, has gone through in terms of contemporary traditional, you know, in seminary, we always heard about congregations. There's people who we're not going to start that rock and roll music over here. And, you know, there's been like rifts, and churches have split over it, right? Little congregations have split over it. And what I think that ushering in of contemporary worship, it has caused us to create a space for those who need that. And it has caused us to be more inclusive. And I think it has made traditional spaces better because I think there's nothing more refining than a little pressure, you know, and then a little like, well, why? At some churches, like, well, everyone's in the contemporary service. But have you taught them what traditional means, like what this high church stuff means? It's amazing to think like just knowing what the paraments and like the altar colors are, you know, we're in a rhythm of a season. We are, you know, it's all very meaningful. And I think people don't necessarily understand it. So I appreciate what y'all are doing here. I think it's made us better having the various forms of worship.
So talking about our clergy on staff, so we have 4 full-time clergy.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. You, Reverend Katie Montgomery Mears, and Reverend Cliff Ritter.
Mm-hmm.
Are all 4 elders? I mean,
We are.
Tom is obviously.
Yes, we are all 4 elders, and Reverend David Horton at Gethsemane is an elder, and then the Huffmans, Gio and Eric, are also elders.
Right. Okay.
I think they're both elders. I know Eric is. So yeah, we are elders.
So anybody on the whole staff or clergy wise can do any of the sacraments, anything. So there's nobody who's limited, I guess, to the assignment of deacon.
Right. Yeah. At my former church, we had a deacon, and he was the co-director of the children's ministry, which could have been its own church in and of itself. It was giant. And he was very much called to this specific type of ministry. And in terms of being the bridge to the world, you know, children's ministry, you bring kids in, you know, after school programs, and then VBS in backyard type of stuff. So he wasn't every Sunday he was not in a worship service. But when we did something like a tenebrae service, then all of the clergy were there together, and he was very much a part of that.
If you had to really Yankee Stadium ballpark this, what would you feel like is the percentage of, I guess, faculty at a Methodist church or staff at a Methodist church being elders or deacons? Like, are there way more elders? Is it about 50-50?
I think it's definitely more elders. I think it is for the churches, but a lot of Methodist churches are not multi-clergy. The lion's share of Methodist churches are one pastor, and so it's usually an elder.
Right. Okay.
And the diaconate, the way we know it, has not been around a very long time.
Right. It used to be the step to being an elder. It used to be a step in the ordination process instead of being its own thing.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right, Sid.
When you say used to be, what's the timeline on that?
25, 30 years?
Yeah, probably so.
Okay.
That's probably right.
Yeah, I remember all the doings around that and the struggle and
yes, all the debates and all the committees, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
What would it be? Who will I be?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'll also throw this in the mix. I believe that out of an abundance of need at some point in the American Methodist Church movement, there were not enough elders to go around. And so the Methodist Church created a role called the Licensed Local Pastor, LLP. I was a LLP before I became a provisional member, which meant I was a provisional elder and could preside over everything. But I was an LLP for 2 years before I was ordained and all that. And that helps kind of small country churches or churches who, because full ordination is a seminary degree, which ain't cheap. There's kind of all these steps. You get a mentor, you go through a book with a mentor, you explore your calling, you do, you're a inquiring candidate, then you're a declared candidate, then it's like steps and steps and steps. And there's a portal somewhere that I think keeps track of it. But yeah, so full ordination is a whole thing, and seminary is just a tiny piece. It's not even a step; it's a requirement for a step, and so it's a whole thing. But with licensed local pastors, they can do what's called course of study, and I believe each conference has its own type of course of study. And really, it's like distance learning. It happens over the course of 5 years. I think you do go to some classes depending on how your conference does it. But yeah, we have quite a few licensed local pastors around who are, and so you're local to your own church. So you can preside over communion and weddings and funerals and, baptism and all that, but it is contained to your local church.
So you're not supposed to be able to hop over to the Methodist church down the street and do all of their sacraments?
Correct. Yeah.
It's a lot.
So
it is a lot.
So walk us through some of your tasks at St. Luke's, and then which of those are things that, we talked about this a little bit, but that you can only do as a member of the clergy, or maybe like not even officially, but that somebody in the Methodist Church, you wouldn't be assigned this job if you're not a member of the clergy. And then what are the things that you do that just anybody who has maybe an education or who works for the church could be doing?
Yeah, great question. So, my first response to that is there's not much that I do that your regular layperson could do. There's not much difference, except when it comes to worship or baptisms or all of that. So remember, the order of the elder is, what are those 4 words? I have them written down. Word, order, sacrament, and service. And so that has to do with, kind of worship, design, the order of the church, which means kind of how it's organized. That kind of stuff is clergy specific.
What about teaching Sunday school, say?
Oh, anybody could teach Sunday school.
Okay. And there's not any particular class or like type of Sunday school or anything like that?
No,
Okay.
there's not. It's, of course, someone who's been to seminary would, has the chops then to teach a pretty good Sunday school, right? But it's not specific to an ordained person. No. When I'd say what it has to do with when you're a multi-clergy site, because we are itinerant, and the church essentially owns us. This is like kind of tacky language to say, but the denomination owns us, right? We are told where we are going to work, and we're told kind of when we're going to move and when we're not. Of course, there's negotiations and talks through all of that, but then we also have a housing allowance, or we live in a parsonage. That's part of the expense of having an elder on staff. There's always, benefits, and I mean, there's a whole compensation package that comes with having an elder. And so if a small congregation has one elder, then say they want to get an associate pastor on staff, they really have to start tithing. I mean, that is a long-term financial bump, right, in a bracket type of thing. So when it comes down to stewardship, the things that I would say just like regular type of business management stuff is that, elders need to do things that I guess is cost effective. Does that make sense? Again, this is all tacky. But
no, I mean, it's like I was just having a conversation with somebody this last week that how you handle finances in the church is a spiritual issue.
Yes.
Because you're dealing with people's spiritual acts of worship. I mean, that's what we profess every Sunday about tithing, about giving of ourselves. This is a spiritual act.
Right.
So how we do that absolutely it's a big deal.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's difficult if, for example, there are some days I'm like, I'm spending so much time just answering emails, and really I need to call that person who's in the hospital. I need to set up a meeting with that person who needs pastoral care. Someone wants to talk about their faith. I want to be with people and be able to be present. And sometimes there's administrative tasks that of course have to be done, but hopefully the work of an elder is not solely administrative tasks, Yeah.
So you work for the United Methodist Church. You don't just work for St. Luke's.
I do. It's kind of weird when if I fill out a medical form or something, they're like, who's your employer? And I'm like, I need a longer line because I'm going to put Texas Annual Conference, but I also need to put St. Luke's United Methodist Church. So yeah, it's, I am employed by the Texas Annual Conference. Mm-hmm.
So you said that if you have you need some guidance or something like that, you reach out to your superintendent.
Yes.
But what's that gap look like between you, superintendent, and the bishop? So like, have you talked to the bishop one-on-one? Is that a thing that everybody would do? Like,
I mean, you can email the bishop, you certainly can, but it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So no, I don't just email the bishop about like, hey, I'm thinking about starting this ministry. He'd be like, great, talk to our church planting coordinator, So
big fan. I just wanted to tell you.
Yeah, big fan. I'm sure he would. I mean,
easier for a layperson to talk to the bishop than it is for a clergy person to talk.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Interesting.
Yeah. Because we have our district superintendents to talk to. And it's kind of like if you go to the bishop, have you gone over the district superintendent's head?
Mm.
And there is a president of the Council of Bishops. We don't have an archbishop, but there is a president of the Council of Bishops.
There is yes. And the Council of Bishops are supposed to keep the other bishops accountable. That's kind of an issue right now. Like how do we keep the bishops accountable if they're not keeping each other accountable? And what do we need to be held accountable to? There's a disagreement about all that. And
so you said like ballpark 66 or so bishops.
Mm-hmm.
So this council you're talking about, is this a smaller group of bishops that are like they kind
No,
of?
the council is all the bishops.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're their own kind of checks and balances?
They are. I think there are, now you're reaching the limit of my, but there's like judicial areas and judicial, I don't know. There's laws that are passed.
Up there, it's sort of.
Yeah.
Well, and the bishop before our present bishop was the president of the Council of Bishops. Janice
Right.
Hughes was the president of the Council of Bishops.
Right. Yeah.
I think too the first time I heard the name Texas Annual Council or Texas Annual Conference, I was very confused because I came from a music education background. So TMEA was our annual conference. We went San Antonio for 3 days, and that was our conference. But calling it like an annual conference, that made me feel like, oh, just everybody gets together and we go hang out
Right.
for a week or something.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that is true. There is a meeting.
Yeah. A conference does sound more like an event instead of a geographical region. I agree. I was confused. I was like, why is it not called like diocese or
Right.
area?
And the fact that ours is called Texas Annual Conference, we're only a slice of Texas. We're not the whole state.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Fun story. When I was in seminary, I was a first-year seminary student. I was all of 24 years old and had no idea that seminary was even like an academic venture, but I learned quickly. But I didn't realize, but they recruit from seminaries, different conferences do, and they want to stay in touch with their students who are at seminary, but they also want to recruit. And so there was this announcement in chapel that the Texas Annual Conference is having a dinner tonight. And if you would like to come, sign up here and it'll be at this fancy restaurant. And I was like, sounds like a steak dinner. Yes. And Texas, I'm from Texas. I was not from the Texas Annual Conference. I was from the Northwest Texas Conference. And I hadn't sorted all this out yet. So I forced a guy from the guys' dorm to drive me to this meal. He was from the Texas Annual Conference and he's a pastor in the area. We're still friends. But I sat next to him, and at the dinner was all the Texas Annual Conference students. There were like 15 people. And Gail Ford Smith was sitting across from me. I don't know if y'all know her, Reverend Gail Ford Smith. And we started talking, and I figured out really quickly that I was at a dinner that I was not supposed to be at. Because there's a Texas Annual Conference.
Oh, so good.
So yes, it's kind of
You were his 1+.
I was his +1. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's kind of I think presumptuous, pretentious for the Texas Annual Conference to just take the name Texas and not like North Texas Conference, Central Texas,
Yeah, something.
Rio Texas Conference.
We're going to be bumping up against our time. I have a question for you that's maybe a little bit off the wall. What's been your most pleasant surprise coming to St. Luke's?
Oh my goodness. There's been so many pleasant surprises. Quite frankly, I love the staff. I have loved getting to know the staff. I was here for 8 months before we shut down, before we went into lockdown. And so I'm still getting to know the congregation via distance. The staff in those 8 months just welcomed me so warmly, along with my husband and kid. And that was just just a pleasant surprise to us. And then I would say in the quarantine times, in our distance loving times, there are people who have been looking for a pastor that I guess is kind of like edgy or something. Like there are people who come to my studies and who want to talk about faith and who want to talk about racism and politics and whatever. I mean, they want to know how their politics fits with their faith. They want to walk these lines that a lot of people are like, I can't, which is fine. But there are some folks who have made themselves known, and I really like having those conversations. I'm an Enneagram 8.
So
I
you're
like the
edgy.
challenge. Pardon?
So you're edgy.
Yeah, I guess I'm edgy. I've been told I'm edgy.
I think that's a good thing.
That's a nice way of putting it, I think.
Well, we always end with a question that's sort of revealing of ourselves personally. Justin and I were talking about just before we started this today. I'm gonna change it just a little bit. We were talking about the question of Easter, etc. With everything that's going on. I'm gonna ask the question, and I'll answer first. How is preparing for this Easter different than preparing for last Easter? Which, of course, we realize preparing for both these Easters is totally different than a quote unquote normal Easter.
Right.
I put on Facebook last year about this time, I think we're about to find out that Easter will happen with or without preparations.
Right.
And because, I mean, people were saying, surely this isn't going to go through
Last.
Easter. Surely we'll be together for Easter. Little did we know, a year later, we would still not be together.
Right.
We've figured out a lot of stuff in a year.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's not not our ideal, we're vastly more comfortable with it now than we were a year ago. Because a year ago, we did Easter people with their iPhones in their living rooms.
Right.
And so you're
yeah.
different.
I'm going to speak to the spiritual nature of it. There, obviously, the logistics look different, and the to-do items are different, and there's recording and planning for the online service and getting online volunteers. Which, if anyone wants to be an online volunteer, email me. But there's this online kind of campus that's growing up among us, and then we're doing some in-person stuff, and there's all that. I mean, it's double time, if not triple time, right? I mean, so we are all doing a lot more. But I would say, in terms of a spiritual nature, coming into Holy Week, I have felt both personally and collectively that we are in a lot more pain than we were a year ago. And we are walking the way to the cross, I believe, in a very different way. And if people will acknowledge that, like, this stinks. I am weary. I am more lonely than I've ever been in my whole life. I am more angry with my church than I've ever been in my whole life, right? Like, if we will get in touch with our suffering, then walking through Holy Week, that's exactly where we're supposed to be. And that is fertile ground for Jesus's message of the gospel to spring up in us on Easter Sunday.
So in a sense, it's a gift.
Yeah, it's a gift. I mean, the suffering, if we let it be, it can be a gift if we let Jesus into it and don't turn our eyes away.
Well spoken. Justin.
Yeah, that's way better than what I was going to say. Just that I was hired in the summer of 2019, and then we were put into quarantine like weeks before all of this. So like Sid said, we were on our phones in our living rooms and trying to figure out. I hadn't experienced any of a traditional Easter service, and so trying to figure out how did this usually go, and then how can it go differently now. And then this year we're sort of hybrid because we are in person, though limited, and so there are some aspects that are similar, but I don't want to say wholly, but in large part without what you would consider the standard Easter fanfare. But we're also doing all of these online services, and they all differ. And so it's really, like you were saying, double or triple time. I mean, we're planning and setting and recording and editing and getting all this stuff together, and we're doing everything in person in many ways as we normally do it. So I'm looking forward to what I would consider a regular, actually traditional Easter service or Holy Week in 2022. Almost 3 years in, I'll finally get to do one.
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's weird. I don't know what a traditional Easter looks like for St. Luke's in person.
Next, the Jews say next year in Jerusalem. Actually, next year on Westheimer. Justin's going to tell you how to get in touch with us if you have questions or a suggested topic or comments. We want to hear all of that.
Any one of us, you can email. You can email Sid S. Davis at stlukesmethodist.org. My email, Justin or J. Bair, that's Bair at stlukesmethodist.org. Or of course, if you have questions for our local expert, Michelle M. Manuel, Manuel at stlukesmethodist.org. We would love to hear from you. And thank you guys so much for watching and for letting us know how this is helping you guys. It's helping me. So if I'm the only one getting something from this, I'm glad, and you're just welcome to watch. It's cool.
By the time you see this, we can all say Happy Easter.
Yes. Happy Easter. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks,
guys. Good to be here.